Hi everyone, and welcome to another module. In this module, I'll give an overview of the research process. I call it From Lightbulb to Print. I'll talk a little bit first about why I think research is important. I think your book does a pretty nice job of laying this out, and your book is obviously a public health leaning sort of a book, so it speaks a lot to public health interventions, to health promotion efforts. And so for the authors of the book, research is really primarily focused on informing practice, and they talk a little bit about evidence-based practice and how we create evidence that will hopefully best inform the health promotion practices that we engage in. For some of you, that may not be exactly what you ultimately want to do, but I think it resonates probably with a lot of you. Within that process of creating evidence that has been based on rigorous research, we also use research to identify priority populations and issues, to identify factors that influence behavior and often health outcomes or a variety of other outcomes. And we also conduct research to understand the mechanisms of the relationships between psychological, social, biological, and behavioral factors. And understanding mechanisms allows us to better plan and implement health promotion activities and efforts. So hopefully I don't have to convince you all that terribly much of the importance of research. I know this is a required class. But I do think research is really important to inform our practice, whether that's therapy or education or some combination of the two. I think research really should be the cornerstone of a lot of those practices. And so I'll talk a little bit about my perspective on research before I jump into this larger research cycle. As I said in the last slide a little bit, these methods that we use, the research methods we use, influence evidence. And your book talks about rigor and conducting research that is rigorous so that we can provide evidence that best informs practices. And so I think at the cornerstone of my teaching about research methods is this premise that methods influence the evidence that we ultimately get. And so understanding methods is the key to evaluating the evidence that you see, to being able to read the research literature and understand the kind of evidence that that article presents for you, to evaluate the quality of that evidence, and to understand how it applies in your particular situation. So I think learning about research methods and data analysis are like filling a toolbox. So there are all sorts of tools we could use in some cases for the same kinds of tasks. And so I think it's useful to be able to consider and utilize a variety of tools for each task. And in research, there's often not necessarily right or wrong decisions. This is exactly what you would do in this situation always and forever. But we should always think about how we provide a rationale for our decisions or justify our decisions. And so being able to have a toolbox from which we can choose a variety of tools and know how to use them, I think is a really useful skill. And our purpose and our research questions should always be at the forefront of all of our research decisions. So are we generating knowledge? Are we evaluating a program? Sort of what part of the research process are we engaged in at that moment? And as I'll say again in a second, I think these conceptual and applied understandings are really key to research. So understanding the applications of research. So this is what we found, and now what do we do with it? What do we do with that information or those results? And thinking conceptually, by that I mean thinking about the concepts that we're looking at. And when we get to measurement, this will make a little bit more sense, but thinking about what it is when we're talking about a concept or a variable like sexual assertiveness or sexual self-esteem, or even something that we tend to think about as a little bit more basic or self-explanatory like sexual risk. So what do we mean by those things, and how do we understand those concepts? How do we measure them, and then how do we apply that knowledge? And we'll talk a little bit about both quantitative and qualitative strategies. Your book talks about qualitative more towards the end, and my perspective on the quantitative divide is that, again, we always want to choose the right tool. for the task. So if our research question is a question that would warrant a quantitative approach, we should use that. And if it's a question that warrants a qualitative approach, that should be our approach. And so there are a lot of people who have very different senses of how qualitative and quantitative research speaks to our sort of broader epistemological understandings of how we create knowledge. And your chapter 2 talks a little bit about some of these epistemological understandings. I'm a little bit more of a pragmatic when it comes to thinking about the qualitative versus quantitative divide. I tend to think about it much more as a sense of what kind of research would best answer the question that we're asking. So that's a bit about my perspective on research. And your chapter 2 goes over a lot of some of the historical context of the way that we conduct scientific inquiry today. That's all interesting, I think. Don't worry so much about memorizing any of that. The key pieces that I would want you to understand from chapter 2 are thinking about the logic and being able to think conceptually, logically, and critically. And one of the reasons I shared the Washington Post article with you and the blog response to that is being able to think both logically and critically, and really being able to dig deep into the research and make the kind of comparisons that the author of the blog post makes in looking at the raw numbers and really thinking a little bit more about what those numbers mean and how we interpret those and what kinds of conclusions we make from data like that. So thinking conceptually, I talked about before, thinking logically and thinking critically. And I'll talk just a little bit about some of the logical fallacies that your book talks about. I think these are really important ones to think about, particularly as we move forward in our own work. I think when we get involved in practice-based work, we start to see patterns, and I think it's hard to necessarily take those patterns and make conclusions about them that are as sound as the ones that we can make via research. And so I think it's really important to think about some of these logical fallacies as we move forward in our own practice and in day-to-day engaging with the world. I think the first one that your book talks about is the with this, therefore, because of this logical fallacy. And I think this one is also often known as correlation does not equal causation. So just because things go together does not mean that one causes the other one. Your book also talks about converse accidents or hasty generalizations. And so this is generalizing from a few cases to an entire group. And we'll talk more later about the dangers of generalizing from a very small sample that we've collected to a larger population of people. That will make a bit more sense when we talk about sampling. Making sweeping generalizations. So when we apply a general rule to a specific situation, despite some sort of indication that the situation is an exception to that rule or that there should be an exception made to that rule. And then finally, your book talks about the after this, therefore because of this. So things that pair together in time, one thing comes before another thing. And so that's sometimes confused for causation. So because something came before another event does not necessarily mean that it caused that other event. And so I think these are all really important things to think about as you move forward in practice, as you read articles and evaluate the assumptions that authors make, and as you write your own paper for this class and think about the assumptions that you're making and the connections that you're making between literatures. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the cycle of research. Your book does a really nice job of laying out what they call the 9 steps of research. I think their road trip analogy is a little bit silly and probably not necessary, but I think their 9 steps and the way that they lay those out is really useful. So those 9 steps are really about the process of designing an individual study, and I think those are really good steps that anybody would go through when designing a study. What I'm going to talk about in this cycle of research is a little bit bigger picture, thinking about how research typically happens out in the world. I have been teaching largely at research universities in my career thus far. And so for those of us who do research as one of the primary components of our academic lives and of our research careers, there tends to be a bit of a cycle in research. And so the first piece of this cycle is always generating research ideas and questions, planning and proposing research, undergoing ethical review and actually conducting the research, and analyzing the data, interpreting the data, and disseminating and applying our results to the world. So the rest of this lecture will serve as a bit of an overview. So I'll go through each of these components of this research cycle and basically give you a little bit of a peek into what we're going to cover for the rest of the semester. So don't worry so much about taking notes and remembering everything. This lecture is really meant to orient you to the whole class more broadly in terms of how we're going to be taking each of these pieces and breaking them down a little bit more. So research ideas and questions. We won't talk a ton about research questions and developing research questions in this class, but we will do a research paper. You will do a research paper. I will not write one. But the first thing that you'll want to do is choose a research topic. And topic ideas usually stem from whatever interests you have, often developed via professional or personal experiences. I see from your message board introductions that you all have some interest that is developed largely from professional or personal experiences. It may be an important public and or behavioral health issue. Likely that overlaps with some of your professional or personal experiences. For those of us who do research that is funded, it may be that we're conducting research and developing research ideas because a certain organization has a funding priority that we may be able to provide some expertise around. And topic ideas always should be grounded in previous research. So we want to see what other people have done and found, and make sure we're not reinventing the wheel every time. We're also often influenced by practical issues. So what kind of expertise we have, what kind of support we have to conduct the research, how much will it cost, are there ethical considerations, design considerations. So we often have a topic and then have to negotiate or massage it a little bit based on practical issues. And I also think we tend to look a lot at academic literature, which should be where we're grounded for the most part in developing our ideas. But I think popular literature is also a great place to really think about the more human side of some of the research. For example, Too Hot to Handle, A Global History of Sex Education, New York Times articles, whatever your area of interest is, being able to do some more pop culture reading or popular literature reading on that topic, I think is a really useful way to sort of connect more narrative ideas of these topics with the academic literature. And then obviously academic literature. And so I'll talk a little bit more about using the academic literature and digesting and synthesizing the academic literature in the lecture for Module 2. But for right now, you should know about the sort of general knowledge of that topic, any controversies in the literature, typical methodologies, and we're often identifying sort of the next steps or gaps that exist in the literature to inform our own choices of research topics. And these topics should be fairly narrow and of value in practice or in the research conversation. And I think your book alludes to this, that so often research questions that we develop are very, very small, and they need to be very small in order to be able to be researched appropriately and with the appropriate level of rigor. So we have our research ideas and our questions, and we want to plan and propose research. So planning involves choosing a research design, which depends on your question. Again, coming back to ethical considerations and financial considerations, practical issues. As I mentioned before, there is often a somewhat large divide between qualitative and quantitative approaches. I think they both take time and both should have well-defined procedures that may need to change over the course of the research process. They both involve researcher-designed questions and materials. Both involve interactions with participants, and really each is appropriate to different kinds of research questions. So we just want to think about what that question is and the kind of research that will best answer that question. Another big part of the process in planning research is selecting measures. And for a lot of kinds of research, things that look at weight or height or time, there are very precise and standard measures of those variables or of those concepts or constructs. But for us, often the things that we're trying to research aren't quite as straightforward. So how do we measure risk of HIV transmission? How do we measure parenting skills or parenting styles or familial love or bonding? How do we measure sexual behavior and intimacy and love? These are much more fuzzy concepts that we have to think a lot about operationalizing and defining, and really thinking about how we most appropriately measure those constructs that aren't quite as concrete as the constructs that some other kinds of science use. We also want to think a lot about choosing participants. Your book talks about choosing the population as your sort of first step in that 9-step research process. They have choosing your sample a bit later in that whole process, but you want to think about whether your sample will be generalizable to a larger population, what your inclusion and exclusion criteria will be, so who is allowed to participate in your study and who is not. Your book talks a bit about statistical power and sample size, and we'll touch on that just a tiny bit more later on in the semester, and thinking about how best to sample from that population. So what kind of sampling techniques are the most appropriate for your situation? Once you do have people in the sample, how do you keep them in the sample if it's a longitudinal study when we're going to follow them over the course of time? We'll talk a bit later about volunteer bias. So the kinds of people who participate in sexuality research in particular tend to be a bit different from the kinds of people who refuse to participate in sexuality research. So it's always something we have to consider when we're thinking about who is actually in our sample. For most of you, you may not think much about research funding. Some of you may go on to work for organizations in which you'll think about writing grants and getting various kinds of funding. In terms of research funding, it's often really important to get funding to actually conduct the research, so to pay participants, to pay staff members, to buy supplies. Another reason that university faculty often get research funding is because universities love money and often desperately need money. And anytime you have, most times when you have larger grants, so if you're getting funding from the federal government, for example, the federal government gives you the money to do the research, and also gives the university a little bit of money because they're housing you, keeping the lights on, water on, etc. So universities really like that money. I mean, everybody likes money, but money can also ease other responsibilities as a faculty member, which gives you more time for research. So you'll often hear about faculty members sort of constantly going after research funding and really looking for money all the time. And that varies from the kind of institution that you're in. For a place like Widener, this is much more of a teaching university, and so people here don't chase funding quite as much as they do in other universities. Although finding money and chasing money requires a lot of patience and a very thick skin. So I'll say a little something about research collaborations. I think we often think about research being conducted individually, but research doesn't and shouldn't occur in a vacuum. I think it's really important to collaborate with people who are not necessarily exactly in your discipline. It's always good to be clear about the roles and responsibilities that everybody will have, and to be collaborative. And for most of you, you may end up partnering with organizations, community stakeholders, places like that, which have their own challenges in terms of partnering with folks who maybe don't do research all the time, or maybe not necessarily don't have a lot of trust in researchers, sometimes for very good reason. but these research collaborations, particularly the ones that cut across disciplines and engage with community partners and stakeholders, I think are really important. So we have planned and proposed our research. One of the sort of essential steps before we can conduct the research is for it to undergo ethical review. We'll talk much more about all of these issues when we get to the ethical and political issues. The basic principles that guide our consideration of ethical principles are beneficence, fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, respect for people's rights and dignity. And so how that translates in research settings is that we think a lot about confidentiality, in storing the data, in presenting the data, in connecting and contacting participants. Another major issue we think about is consent, informed consent or assent if we're talking about minors. And this is making sure that they have enough information to make an informed decision about whether or not they want to participate in the research. Do they understand all the benefits and all the risks, and are they of sound mind and able to consent to participate in the research? We also want to think about cultural competency. So in our assessment materials, in our interactions with participants, and making sure that we are sort of being respectful and making sure that research is equitably distributed, or the benefits of research are equitably distributed. Obviously, ensuring safety and avoiding harm are really key pieces of this process. Many of you probably have heard of IRBs, institutional review boards. These are groups of people at universities who review and ultimately, hopefully, approve your research process or ask you to make changes to it before you can actually conduct the research. And then finally, after all that, we want to make it happen. So we have to create protocols or instructions, basically. We have to create all the materials. There may be surveys and interview guides. We have to train staff members if we have staff members involved. Do we want to pilot everything out and make sure that it works? Generally, the answer is yes. There are often way more mistakes than you ever anticipate making. You have to recruit participants, enroll them, retain them in your research process. Create materials and methods for doing that. Then you actually have to conduct the assessments. And you want to make sure that you do that in a way such that your participants are happy, because that leads to good data and better retention of your participants. And as we'll talk about later when we get to measurement, how we ask the questions is often just as important as what we're actually asking people. How do we keep track of them if it's longitudinal research? How do we manage data? How do we create data sets and make sure that those data sets are quality, that all the data is entered correctly, and think about storing that data in a way that complies with ethical standards and maintains confidentiality or anonymity of your participants. So there's a lot involved in that making it happen component. And so once we've done all that, we want to analyze, interpret, and disseminate, and ideally apply our results. We'll talk just a little bit about analyzing data in this course. We won't get into all that much detail, but we'll talk just a bit about analyzing data and determining appropriate analyses, and reporting and interpreting our findings and drawing conclusions. We'll talk a little bit about presenting research. I think this is always a really good thing. There's often a lot of professional meetings where we can present posters or oral presentations. And we do this because we want to tell people about the research that we've done. We want to build a reputation for ourselves or for our organizations, to develop collaborations and research networks, to get feedback on our research process and hopefully improve that process. For professional development, for those of you who are thinking of going on in academia, this is great to have on your CV or your resume. And I think in general, presentation skills are so important for us. So I think anytime you have a chance to participate in this kind of research and present, it's always a good thing. So for those of us who are in academia, a big part of our world is publishing our research. And so peer review is typically the way that is the sort of most respected way of publishing in academia. You may have heard the term before, publish or perish. It's really important for those of us in faculty positions to publish. It's one of the ways in which our work is evaluated. and that we get promotion and tenure. And in some graduate programs, this is also required. I was talking to a student who is working with me and here from Mexico, and in order to get her PhD, she actually has to publish 2 articles. And so I think that's a bit more rare of a requirement, but that is something that they have to do. So publish or perish is something that you'll hear. These are the currency, peer review publications are the currency of academia and of research. And when I say peer review, I'm talking about a process wherein you submit a manuscript that reports on your research, and that manuscript is sent out to often 2, sometimes 3 different experts in your field, and they give you feedback, and they ultimately decide or recommend to an editor whether they think your paper should be accepted for publication, revised and resubmitted, or rejected. And so a big part of that process is often choosing a journal and deciding who your audience is going to be, thinking about how wide-reaching the impact will be if you publish in that particular journal, being able to integrate feedback, which we'll do a lot of over the course of this semester. And for those of us who submit a lot, being able to accept rejection is a challenge. So one of the things that I want you to be able to leave this class with is the ability to evaluate research, to evaluate evidence. And you can do that based on prior literature and theory, based on the objectivity that you see in that article, whether they have clearly stated research questions and hypotheses, whether the methods are appropriate for those research questions or purposes. The ability to be replicated is a key piece of this, and the This American Life podcast that I've asked you to listen to speaks a lot to that replication piece. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, and maybe I'll link to it, there is a great John Oliver piece about replication in science, and so our ability to replicate research is a key piece of evaluating that research, even if we don't actually do that replication very much. The research should be generalizable in terms of having an impact and being able to say that this is important for more than just the people who were in this research study. We'll talk a bit more about evaluating accuracy of research, particularly validity and reliability, and thinking about rigorous and appropriate data analysis, and whether the conclusions then are appropriate based on those analyses and on those results. So this is a main piece that I want you to get out of this class, to be able to move forward and understand the research literature, to be able to understand when methods are appropriate for different kinds of research, and to be able to evaluate each of these different points so that you can understand the quality of the evidence and think a little bit about how to apply that evidence. And ultimately, hopefully, this last step in the research process will be applying research to the real world. And that may be a component that a lot of you are involved in as you move forward and do educational work or therapy work. You'll want to be able to go to the research literature and think about how that literature informs your day-to-day practice. A lot of people call translational research research that actually does try and conduct interventions in applied settings like hospitals or clinics or schools, and or therapeutic practice, and then evaluate that application. There's often really huge issues with fidelity to protocol. So do people actually do what the curriculum says to do? Do people adhere to different therapeutic modalities when they actually do them in the real world? And so a key piece of this is understanding the critical components of curriculum or therapeutic practices, identifying the appropriate outcomes that we want to look at to be able to evaluate efficacy, for example, how effective that intervention or that therapeutic practice is, figuring out if it works for certain groups of people more than others. And your book talks a little bit about community-based participatory research, and so we'll cover that just a little bit, and thinking about how do we engage community members to be a more active part of the research process, particularly for health promotion and intervention kinds of work, getting them engaged in that process and making sure that you have community buy-in, and community-informed health promotion efforts. So that's that whole research cycle. And essentially, we just repeat this. So for those of us who do research sort of more full-time in our lives, this is a cycle that we have going on all the time. And I have tons of papers that are in each of this papers and ideas and projects that are in all stages of this process right now. And every time I finish a study, I come out with some more questions and then go through that process again. Your book talks a little bit about this iterative process of research, and this is a little bit what we see from here. Hopefully the answers that you come out of a project with will then develop into new research ideas and questions, which starts that whole cycle again. The last point that I'll make is that it involves a ton of people to do research. So a lot of projects have anywhere from 5 to 50 or more people working on the project over the life of the project, not counting the participants. And for those of you who are at all interested in doing research in your careers, in perhaps moving forward and getting a PhD and getting involved in research in that way, I can't stress enough how important I think it is and how useful I think it is to get involved in that research process early on. So for those of you who are interested in that, feel free to reach out to me and let's chat more about how you can get involved either at Widener or at another institution. And I think that's accessible and really important to inform your future career decisions or interests, or prepare you for more study if that's what you're interested in. So that's it for this module. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, post those under the general discussion forum. I've asked you to do a few readings and post your ideas about the readings in the podcast. So those are under the Module 1 reading response topic. And if you have any other questions or thoughts, post them online or drop me an email. All right, thanks.